I was doing some boots on the ground exploration of old world Tartarian styled architecture in Colorado, specifically in the city called Steamboat Springs, and I ran across this building right here, which is very much a Tartarian architecture style of building. It took me a second, not really a long time, but at first I was like, oh, maybe that's an older one, but then you get up closer and it's like, no, this is definitely new. There's some very serious differences between this building and actual old world Tartarian ones. And I'll show you one of the main things about that, which is that there are no signs of mud flood on this building. So this building right here, it has a stone appearance, obviously, as you can see, but that is just a facading of stone right there. And when we look at it from this side right here, you can see that there's this tower right here with bells in it. So they got a bell tower on it. They've got the Celtic cross here on top. Just everything about this is like an exact replica of a lot of these old stone Tartarian churches that a lot of us have seen on other channels and that I've pointed out several times on this channel. Like right here, here's a picture of a church, an old stone church that I found in Vermont or New Hampshire, one of those two states, can't remember. I'll put it on the screen, whichever state it is though, and you see the big Celtic cross on front of it, huge stone structure with signs of being mud flooded. If we look at this building right here, this is one I covered recently in Ness City, Kansas. They call this the skyscraper of the plains. It's a completely huge stone structure, and you can see at the bottom here there's a railing keeping people away from these other stories that descend down into the ground. Same thing with this old stone church right here. If I zoom in, you can see that they've got some planters out inside of these other levels with windows that are descending down into the ground. Very, very common for a lot of these old stone buildings to have just full levels of buried windows. And a lot of people, like I just said, will say, oh no, they just built basements and stuff. But then when you come to this newly built building, which is clearly Tartarian style mimic replica architecture, if we look along the bottom of this building, there's not a single buried window anywhere. It looks like you would expect it to look. Like there's the ground and that's it. There's not windows being buried into the ground, and you don't have to put odd railings and interesting like random stairways up into windows that have been busted out like this right here. Everything's just normal and natural and makes sense where it's at, and the ground level is indeed the ground level. And so now some of you might be thinking, well, they just didn't build a basement in this building, so that's why there's none of that windows going down into the basement. There is a basement in this building, and even with the basement in this building and all this Tartarian style, old world style castle architecture, there's no buried windows descending into the ground. There's no busted out windows with new steps added to get into those busted out windows that have been turned into entrances. This really is just a proof of building this style of architecture in modern times. You're not building windows into the ground as part of the style and design of these structures. When we see stuff like this, where there's these windows and levels going into the ground and different entrances and all that built up, like this is clearly evidence that there is actually flooding and burial that has occurred on these huge stone architecture buildings. And here's a construction photo of this building, and this looks like a legit construction photo right here, like we do not see on these other old world stone Tartarian buildings. This is like a proper construction site right here. You got the tractors, you got the actual piles of material that are used to actually build this building, like a lot of these other old world ones that are much older than we're told. They'll go stack up some lumber next to this huge stone structure that already looks like it's hundreds of years old, which doesn't make sense. Like, where's all the stone? This is a proper construction site photo right here. You got the tractors, you got the cranes, you got the fences, you got the paved roads that hauled in the supplies, and then you've got the actual supplies that are used to build the building sitting all around the building. Proper construction photo right here. Also, you don't see buried windows descending into the ground like you do on these old builds. And then right here, like I said, it's got this bell tower on it, and these bells are tiny compared to the bells in these old world Tartarian buildings, these 1800s, right, builds from early cowboys and coal miners. The bells that they had in those were huge compared to these bells. And more specifically about its style, this design, they call it a mountain of stone. Wow, how interesting. Oh, and I forgot to mention, when we went back and we look at this construction photo, where's the stone? No stone here. This is a stick frame, cheap, lightweight lumber house, but then it's just been facaded with a little bit of stone to make it look like it's stone, but it's actually not really a stone structure. So like weight wise and transportation of materials wise, this is much, like this is basically a feather compared to these actual fully stone walls that we see in these true old world Tartarian style buildings that we're told were built in the 1800s. In addition to its resemblance of the top of the mountain, this material was chosen because of its connection to St. Peter. In my videos, a common thing that I'm pointing out is that what we call our mountains nowadays are not actually rock and dirt piles that Mother Nature cast up 300 billion years ago, but it's actually old stone masonry architecture built by men sitting in ruin. We know that there were huge pyramid civilizations previously and they built a bunch of pyramids. We're just taught that that never happened in the United States of America and that a lot of our other mountains are just cast up by Mother Nature. But what's actually much more accurate is that there were extremely advanced, rich stone masonry civilizations prior to us in the world and in the United States of America, and their architecture still sits here. It's just covered up in dirt and shrubbery and is sitting in ruin, but it's our mountains and our hills are actually old pyramid and castle style architecture, which is exactly what we're seeing right here. They're calling this type of style of architecture, these towers, these peaks, and all the stone used, they're calling this a mountain of stone, resembling the top of a mountain. And if you look at these shapes of these roofs and peaks and towers, and you look at mountains, you'll find all the same shapes and peaks and towers, just in a ruined type of form and covered up with dirt and shrubs. But it's the same thing. I'll just propose the question. If there were extremely advanced stone masonry civilizations building, and they were extremely populous, building huge pyramid style cities and huge castle style cities, what would that look like a bunch of years later if all of that is still here but sitting in ruin? Our mountains and our hills. And that's exactly what we're seeing right here, is if this right here got nuked or whatever, bombed, I don't think billions of years is a real timeline, but let's roll with that for a second. If this long ways down the road, and if this was actually built fully out of stone, was sitting in ruin many years down the road, what would it look like? People would roll up to this and go, oh, that's an interesting rock formation. That's an interesting mountain. Our school books nowadays would tell us that it was built 300 billion years ago by tectonic plate shifting. Or is it just old stone masonry architecture sitting in ruin? Is that what our mountains and our hills are? And is that what this replica Tartaria castle church building is hinting at and showing us right here? Is that this is the resemblance of the top of a mountain. It's architecture. And if this architecture was truly made out of pure stone and we rolled up on it 3,000 years later after it had been sitting in ruin and got bombed or whatever, it's the top of a mountain covered in dirt and shrubs. So mountains are architecture. In the scriptures, Old Testament, New Testament, Book of Mormon, they're going in and out of their mounts and mountains a lot. Jesus, for example, stayed in the Mount of Olives for several nights. It's not a dirty, dusty cave. These weren't dirty, dusty cavemen. These were rich, advanced people, like the scriptures say, though. The Bible videos that were showing us of poor dirt rag people is deceptive, extremely deceptive. Those people are never described in the scriptures. The people described in the scriptures are rich, advanced people that practiced stone masonry and built castles and palaces and synagogues and temples and had roads and machinery and had gold and silver and copper, brass, iron, and precious stones and precious gems, not poor dirt rag people. And so that's the type of civilizations that built this type of stuff, and they were masterful pyramid and castle builders. That's who the scriptures talk about. And that's why Jesus was staying in the Mount of Olives for several nights, because he was staying in that mount or pyramid. Moses, when he went up into the Mount Sinai to meet with God, he wasn't going into a dirty, dusty cave. He was going into a nice, big, beautiful pyramid to meet with God. He went up into the mount and met with God. He went in and out of it. Nephi, in the Book of Mormon, says he went up into the mount to pray often. It's pyramid architecture. not dirty, dusty cave. And this is why stonemasonry terminology is constantly used in the scriptures. Christ is supposed to be our foundation. Foundation is what is needed for building huge stone structures. Christ is also supposed to be the chief cornerstone. The cornerstone is the block that you put in place, and if all your measurements are correct and precise off of that, then you can build a huge, big, super strong, super heavy, beautiful structure. But if your foundation and your cornerstone and all of your angles and measurements off of that are not perfect and not precise, then as you continue to stack more and more weight, what's beneath it will start to crack and crumble, and now you have a structure that won't stand for very long. So the scriptures are full of stonemasonry terminology because those people were advanced, rich stonemasonry civilizations. And it's still that same terminology and language for us nowadays because we're still supposed to apply those same principles of what it takes to build a super strong stone structure to our spiritual life, but also in a much more like real physical look at the evidence type of way. It's so we can see that like, oh, well, yeah, why are they talking about mountains and hills and mounts this way in the scriptures and with all this stonemasonry terminology? And then we have all these mountains and hills and mounts everywhere sitting in ruin. Maybe we can start to connect the dots here, and the scriptures can actually start to point out the truth to us that many, if not most, of our mountains and hills is actually old pyramid style architecture from these ancient civilizations that are talked about in the scriptures. And then when you go inside of this church castle, this Tartarian replica, when you go to the altar, this is what the altar looks like. And right here, these are 3 pyramids right here. One right here in the middle, another one on the right side, and another one on the left side, and then probably a much bigger one behind it, but that gets leveled off here and turned into the altar. And what do they say right here? In the center of the sanctuary floor stands the altar made of Colorado red granite, its base depicting a mountain. Here again is the image, God's holy mountain, a symbol of the heavenly Jerusalem in the words of the prophet Isaiah. So this whole Tartarian structure design from the exterior is designed as the top of the mountain. And then when you come to the altar once again is a mountain. So when the scriptures are talking about mountains, they're not talking about dirty, dusty caves. They're talking about pyramid architecture. And these people back then were masterful stonemasonry architects. And a lot of this mud-flooded architecture that we see everywhere is left over from them. And the buried windows and the buried basements and all that is actual proof that there was disaster that has buried not just individual buildings, but full cities of architecture that these people previously built. And this Tartarian replica church castle right here, top of the mountain with a mountain altar inside of it, doesn't have any of these buried windows because it was built recently and there's no need or reason to really build that way. But if some really tall buildings and cities were here previously that got buried, then now there's a decent explanation for all these buried windows and stuff. So very interesting church right here, showing, in my opinion, that mud flood and these buildings actually being buried is real because they built a replica of those buildings without the mud flooded windows, even when it has a basement. And then on top of that, it's got all the stuff. It's got the bell towers, the Celtic cross, the mountains, the arches. This building right here is really telling a ton of story. Way more story than you think when you're just driving by it.